In the predawn darkness of July 16, 1945, a heavy cruiser slipped quietly out of San Francisco Bay. USS Indianapolis cut through the fog like a ghost, her destination classified, her cargo unknown even to most of her crew. Locked in a sealed compartment below deck sat a lead bucket containing a mysterious cylinder, half of the enriched uranium that would, in less than a month, incinerate a Japanese city and change human history forever. The men aboard had no idea they were carrying the atomic age itself, and none of them could have imagined that after successfully completing the most important mission of World War II, their ship would become a floating tomb, and the ocean around them would turn red with blood. This is the story of USS Indianapolis, the ship that delivered death to Hiroshima, and then met a fate so horrifying that it would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. July 1945. The war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier with Germany's unconditional surrender, but in the Pacific, the dying continued. American forces were island, hopping their way toward Japan's home islands, paying for every coral reef and jungle clearing with American blood. Iwo Jima had cost nearly 7,000 American lives. Okinawa, which had just concluded, killed over 12,000 American servicemen and wounded 38,000 more. Projected invasion of mainland Japan Operation Downfall promised casualties so staggering that military planners were already ordering 500,000 Purple Hearts to be manufactured in anticipation. But in the New Mexico desert, in absolute secrecy, scientists had just successfully tested a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Trinity test on July 16th proved that mankind could now harness the power of the sun itself. The atomic bomb was real, and it was ready. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh Roman III stood on the bridge of USS Indianapolis as his ship prepared to depart Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. At 46 years old, McVeigh was a third-generation naval officer. His father had been an admiral, and the sea was in his blood. He'd taken command of Indianapolis just 8 months earlier, in November 1944, and had already led her through the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese kamikaze pilots had turned themselves into guided missiles. McVeigh was a well-liked commander, firm but fair, respected by his officers and enlisted men alike. But on this particular morning, as stevedores loaded mysterious crates aboard his ship under armed guard, even he wasn't told what he was carrying. The orders came from the highest levels. 2 Army officers, Major Robert Furman and Captain James Nolan, boarded Indianapolis with a sealed wooden crate, 15 feet long and 5 feet wide, and a lead bucket weighing about 200 pounds. The crate contained components of the Little Boy bomb mechanism. The bucket contained something far more dangerous, enriched uranium-235, one of only 2 such shipments in existence. The other half would travel separately by air. Furman and Nolan were told that if the ship went down, they were to save the bucket first, before their own lives if necessary. They kept it chained in the cabin they shared, taking turns sleeping beside it. Captain McVeigh was given only the barest information. This cargo was of the highest importance to the war effort. He was to deliver it to Tinian Island in the Marianas with maximum speed. Every day saved could end the war sooner. That was all he needed to know. The crew of 196 men sensed something unusual was happening. They'd loaded ammunition before, bombs before, all kinds of war material. But this level of secrecy, armed guards watching over 2 Army officers who refused to leave their cabin. Sailors are natural gossips, and rumors spread through the ship like wildfire. Some thought they were carrying gold. Others whispered about a new super weapon. Most just shrugged and did their jobs. In wartime, you learned not to ask too many questions. On July 16, 1945, the same day the atomic fireball rose over the New Mexico desert USS Indianapolis, cast off her moorings, and headed into the Pacific. Her cruising speed was typically around 25 knots, but McVeigh pushed her harder. The ship had just completed repairs from kamikaze damage sustained off Okinawa, and now she was being asked to run at nearly full speed across the largest ocean on Earth. The crew didn't mind. Speed meant they might complete whatever this mission was quickly and get some real liberty. Maybe even make it home sooner. They had no way of knowing that most of them would never see home again. To understand what happened to Indianapolis, you first have to understand what she was not just a ship, but a symbol of American naval power in an age when battleships and cruisers were the apex predators of the seas. USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser commissioned in 1932. She was 610 feet long, displaced nearly 10.0 tons, and bristled with 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, capable of hurling 335-pound shells over 15 miles. She carried 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and could make 32 knots at flank speed, fast enough to run down most enemy ships or escape those she couldn't fight. But Indianapolis was more than just her guns and armor. She'd been the flagship of Scouting Force 1 before the war, and in 1936 had the honor of carrying President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself on a goodwill cruise to South America. The president's personal bathtub was still aboard, installed specially for him and kept as a point of pride. When war broke out, Indianapolis proved her worth again and again. She fought in the Aleutian Islands campaign in 1942. She supported the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas. She bombarded Saipan and Tinian, the very island she was now racing toward with her atomic cargo. She shelled Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing fire support for the Marines wading ashore into hell. At Okinawa, on March 31, 1945, her luck nearly ran out. A Japanese Zero fighter, already damaged and dying, dove straight into her stern in a kamikaze attack. The explosion tore a hole in her hull, flooded 2 compartments, killed 9 men, and wounded 20 more. Indianapolis limped to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California for repairs, the same repairs she'd just completed before departing on this secret mission. The crew that sailed her out of San Francisco was a mixture of seasoned combat veterans and fresh-faced replacements. Some had been with the ship since before Pearl Harbor. Others had just arrived from training, eager to see action before the war ended. They were fathers and sons, farm boys and city kids, welded together by the peculiar alchemy of naval service into a functioning organism of 196 souls. They trusted their ship. They trusted their captain. They trusted that the Navy wouldn't send them into danger without protection. That trust would prove to be misplaced. The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond human comprehension, covering more than 63 million square miles, nearly a third of Earth's entire surface. To cross it at speed, alone, in wartime, was to make yourself a target in the largest shooting gallery ever conceived. But Indianapolis had her orders: maximum speed, minimum delay. The first leg took her to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii 91 nautical miles covered in a breakneck 5 hours, averaging over 28 knots. The crew began to realize this wasn't just another mission. Ships didn't run that hard unless something extraordinary was at stake. At Pearl Harbor, they stopped only long enough to refuel. 10 hours and they were gone again, racing southwest toward Tinian. Captain McVeigh requested an escort, standard procedure for a capital ship in contested waters, but was told none was available. Indianapolis would make the run alone. The ship's routine settled into the rhythm of wartime steaming. Watches rotated every 4 hours. Gunners manned the anti-aircraft batteries, scanning the skies for Japanese planes. Sonar operators listened for the telltale ping of submarine contacts. The sea was empty. No friendly ships, no convoys, just endless blue water and the white wake streaming behind them. Below decks, in the cabin they shared, Major Furman and Captain Nolan took turns guarding the lead bucket. They'd been briefed on what it contained, sworn to absolute secrecy, and told that if the ship sank, they should attempt to save it. If that proved impossible, they were to ensure it sank in water too deep to recover. The uranium inside represented months of work, millions of dollars, and the efforts of thousands of scientists and engineers. More importantly, it represented the chance to end the war without invading Japan. On the morning of July 26, 1945, after traveling 300 miles in just 10 days, USS Indianapolis dropped anchor off Tinian Island. The cargo was offloaded immediately. The wooden crate and the lead bucket were transferred ashore under heavy guard and transported to a secure area where the 509th Composite Group, the unit that would deliver the bomb, was already preparing for their mission. The B-29 bomber Enola Gay was being modified for the special weapon. Her crew was training for the flight that would change history. Major Furman and Captain Nolan stayed on Tinian. Their mission was complete. They delivered the heart of the atomic bomb safely across the Pacific. They would remain on the island, watch the final assembly, and eventually witness the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima on August 6th. For them, the mission was a success. For the crew of USS Indianapolis, the nightmare was just beginning. With their secret cargo delivered, Indianapolis needed a new assignment. The ship had been running hard for 10 days straight. The crew needed rest, the engines needed maintenance, and Captain McVeigh expected to be sent to a rear area for a brief respite before rejoining the fleet for the final push toward Japan. The orders that came instead would doom them all. Indianapolis was directed to sail to Guam, just 120 miles south, for minor refitting and to take on some replacement crew. From there, she would proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where she would join Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 95, conducting training exercises in preparation for the invasion of Japan. The route was plotted: Guam to Leyte, approximately 200 nautical miles across the Philippine Sea. It was a standard transit route used regularly by Navy ships, but it passed through waters known to be frequented by Japanese submarines, a fact that should have prompted additional precautions. Captain McVeigh again requested an escort. Again, he was told none was available. He asked about the latest intelligence on Japanese submarine activity along his route. He was told incorrectly that the threat was minimal. Anti-submarine patrols were active, he was assured. The route was as safe as any in the Pacific at this stage of the war. This was catastrophically wrong, but McVeigh had no way to know it. What naval intelligence did know, but failed to properly communicate, was that Japanese submarine I-58 had recently been detected in the exact waters Indianapolis would be crossing. The submarine had already attacked and missed several targets. She was still out there hunting. On July 28th, Indianapolis departed Guam at 9:00 a.m. The sea was calm, the weather fair. The ship settled into a cruising formation, steaming westward toward Leyte at 17 knots, a comfortable speed that balanced the need for progress with fuel conservation. No escort accompanied her, no air cover was provided. She sailed alone into enemy waters, following a predictable route at a predictable speed. Captain McVeigh ordered a standard zigzag pattern, a defensive maneuver where the ship periodically changed course to make herself harder to target by submarines, but zigzagging was exhausting for the crew and slowed progress. Navy regulations allowed captains to cease zigzagging at night if visibility was poor or at their discretion based on threat assessment. On the night of July 29th, the sea was calm and visibility was moderate. The moon would rise just before midnight. McVeigh authorized the ship to steam a straight course, with orders to resume zigzagging if visibility improved or the moon rose. It was a reasonable decision, well within his authority and standard practice, but it would later be used to destroy him. As the sun set on July 29, 1945, the men of USS Indianapolis settled into their evening routines. Some wrote letters home. Others played cards, read, or chatted with friends. The cooks prepared midnight rations for the watchstanders. In the engine rooms, men monitored the great turbines that pushed the ship through the water. The ship was buttoned up for night steaming, not at full combat readiness, but secure. Watertight doors were closed, watches were set, the sea was empty and dark. 1,300 miles to the north, in a radio studio in Tokyo, a woman the Americans called Tokyo Rose was broadcasting her nightly propaganda program. She played American music and tried to demoralize Allied troops with taunts about their girlfriends back home for getting them. But on this night, her broadcast contained something unusual, a specific claim that would later seem like prophecy or perhaps leaked intelligence. "We've just sunk the Indianapolis. All hands were lost." The broadcast happened hours before the ship was actually attacked, likely a coincidence, or perhaps referring to a different ship, or simply invention meant to unsettle American servicemen. But sailors who survived would later remember it with chills. Because in just a few hours, Tokyo Rose's claim would become horrifyingly true. While Indianapolis steamed westward through the Philippine Sea, she was being stalked. Japanese submarine I-58 was a Type B-3 submarine, one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most advanced. She was 356 feet long, could dive to 330 feet, and carried 19 torpedoes plus 6 chitin, manned suicide torpedoes that were essentially one-man submarines piloted to their targets by volunteers who had no intention of returning. Her commander was Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, a 35-year-old career submarine officer who had survived 3 years of brutal undersea warfare. Hashimoto was competent, experienced, and deeply committed to the Emperor. By July 1945, with Japan clearly losing the war, he and his crew had nothing left but duty and honor. I-58 had departed Kure Naval Base on July 16th, the same day Indianapolis left San Francisco on what everyone knew might be her final patrol. Japan's submarine force had been devastated by American anti-submarine warfare. Fuel was scarce, spare parts were non-existent, and every patrol was increasingly likely to be one-way. Hashimoto had been hunting for targets for nearly 2 weeks with little success. He'd spotted several American ships, but hadn't been able to get into firing position. His orders were to disrupt American supply lines and sink whatever he could. The chitin pilots aboard were eager for martyrdom, constantly asking permission to launch. Hashimoto resisted. Chitin were valuable weapons, not to be wasted on marginal targets. But on the night of July 29th, Hashimoto was running on the surface, recharging his batteries, when his lookout spotted something extraordinary. A large ship alone, steaming a straight course, silhouetted against the rising moon. At first, Hashimoto couldn't believe his eyes. American ships rarely traveled alone, and never without zigzagging. This had to be a trap. Perhaps a destroyer pretending to be a large target, hoping to draw him in. He studied the silhouette carefully through his periscope. The shape was wrong for a destroyer. Too big, too many superstructures. This was a cruiser, possibly even a battleship. Hashimoto called his crew to battle stations. I-58 submerged to periscope depth and began her attack run. The chitin pilots begged to launch. Hashimoto considered it, then decided to use conventional torpedoes instead. The target was perfect, so perfect it seemed unreal. He fired 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern, then dove deep to avoid the expected counterattack. Aboard USS Indianapolis, the sea was calm and the night was quiet. Then at 12:05 a.m. on July 30th, the ocean exploded. First torpedo struck Indianapolis on her starboard bow, just forward of the bridge. The explosion was catastrophic. A column of water and flame shot hundreds of feet into the air as the warhead detonated against the ship's hull. The blast tore through the forward compartments, obliterating everything in its path. Seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships, directly below the bridge. This one was even worse. The explosion ripped into the ship's fuel tanks, igniting thousands of gallons of bunker oil. A fireball erupted from the center of the ship, turning night into day. The force of the blast bent steel plates like cardboard and sent men flying through the air like rag dolls. Of the 6 torpedoes Hashimoto fired, only 2 struck home. But 2 was more than enough. The forward torpedo had destroyed the bow compartments completely. Men sleeping in their bunks never knew what hit them. They were killed instantly by the blast or drowned in seconds as the ocean roared in through the massive hole torn in the ship's side. The compartments were sealed tombs before anyone could react. The second torpedo was even more devastating. It struck directly beneath the ship's bridge and forward engine room, rupturing fuel tanks and severing the ship's power. Instantly, Indianapolis went dark. All electrical power died. The engines stopped. The pumps that might have fought the flooding went silent. The radio room went dead before anyone could send a distress signal. In the engine rooms below, men were fried by superheated steam as the boilers ruptured. The temperature in those spaces went from tropical heat to several hundred degrees in seconds. Those who didn't die instantly were trapped as watertight doors automatically sealed, locking them in with the rising water and scalding steam. Private First Class Giles McCoy, a Marine assigned to the ship, was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion. He would later describe the sound. It was like a sledgehammer hitting a tin roof, only 1,000 times louder. Then everything went dark and the ship lurched like she'd hit a brick wall. On the bridge, Captain McVeigh was thrown to the deck. He pulled himself up, demanding reports, trying to understand what had happened. But the communication systems were dead. The ship's internal phone network, silent. The engine order telegraph, not responding. He sent runners to assess the damage, but in the darkness and chaos, reliable information was impossible to get. What McVeigh could see was bad enough. The entire bow of his ship was gone or going under. The ship was listing heavily to starboard, already down by the bow, and tilting further with every second. Fires raged amidships, fed by ruptured fuel lines. Men were screaming. The smell of burning oil and flesh filled the air. Commander Joseph Flynn, the ship's executive officer, fought his way to the bridge to report. The news was catastrophic. The forward compartments were completely flooded. Dozens of men were already dead. The power was out, and the ship was taking on water faster than any pump could handle, even if the pumps were working, which they weren't. McVeigh asked if they could save the ship. Flynn's face told him everything he needed to know. The captain faced the hardest decision any naval officer can make. His ship, the vessel he'd commanded through battles, the ship that had carried presidents, the warship that had just completed the most important mission of the war, was dying. He could feel her going under his feet, the deck tilting further with each passing moment. At 12:08 a.m., just 3 minutes after the first torpedo struck, Captain Charles McVeigh gave the order no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. But there was a problem. With no electrical power, the ship's public address system was dead. The order would have to be passed by word of mouth, shouted from man to man in the darkness and chaos. Many sailors would never hear it. Many more wouldn't believe it. You don't just abandon a heavy cruiser. Ships this big don't sink, not in 12 minutes. This had to be survivable. It wasn't. Abandoning a ship is a complex operation under the best circumstances. It requires organization, discipline, and time. The crew of Indianapolis had none of these. In the darkness, no electrical power meant no lights anywhere on the ship. Men groped blindly trying to find life jackets, life rafts, anything that would float. The standard Kapok life jackets were stored in lockers throughout the ship, but in the chaos and darkness, many men couldn't find them. Some grabbed jackets only to discover they'd been damaged or had rotted in the tropical heat. The Kapok filling turned to powder. The ship carried life rafts and floater nets, large cargo nets with flotation devices attached, but these were secured to the deck with heavy lines. In theory, sailors were supposed to cut them free and throw them overboard. In practice, in the dark, on a ship tilting at an increasingly severe angle, with fires raging and explosions echoing through the hull, many of the rafts never made it off the ship. Some men tried to follow procedure. Damage control parties attempted to fight the fires, but without water pressure, the hoses were useless. Others tried to move wounded shipmates topside, carrying burned and broken men up ladders that were becoming increasingly difficult to climb as the ship's angle steepened. In the sick bay, Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's senior medical officer, was thrown from his bunk by the explosion. He made his way through smoke, filled corridors to his medical station, where he found wounded men already being brought in. But there was nothing he could do. No power meant no lights to operate by, and the ship was clearly going down. Haynes began directing wounded men topside, helping those who could walk and ordering others to carry those who couldn't. One sailor, Adolfo Celaya, had been blown out of his bunk and across the compartment by the blast. When he regained consciousness, he was waist, deep in water that was rising fast. The compartment's hatch was jammed. He and several other men threw themselves against it repeatedly until it finally burst open, and they stumbled out into a passageway that was itself flooding. They climbed up, always up, following other men toward the sound of fresh air and open sky. On the main deck, men were jumping into the ocean. Some had life jackets, many didn't. Some jumped from the low side of the ship, the starboard side that was tilting toward the water. Others, in panic or confusion, ran to the high side, the port side that was now rising into the air, and jumped from heights of 40 or 50 feet, hitting the water with bone, breaking impact. The ship's list was increasing rapidly now. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. The starboard side was nearly awash, while the port side pointed toward the stars. Men who hesitated too long found themselves clinging to vertical decks, unable to maintain their grip on oil, slicked steel. Radioman second class, Jack Miner, had been on watch in the radio room when the torpedoes hit. The blast knocked out all power before he could send a distress call. He tried the emergency radio, but it was damaged. He tried everything he could think of, but nothing worked. No message went out. No one knew Indianapolis had been hit. Miner finally abandoned the radio shack and made his way topside, the knowledge that he'd failed to call for help weighing on him as heavily as the life jacket he'd managed to find. In the water around the ship, men were already swimming away, trying to put distance between themselves and the dying vessel. They'd heard the stories. The suction when a big ship goes down can pull swimmers under with it. Whether this was true or myth, no one wanted to find out. Captain McVeigh remained on the bridge as long as he could, watching his crew abandon ship, counting heads in his mind, knowing that many men were already dead below and many more would die in the water. He'd done everything by the book, set proper watches, maintained discipline, followed his orders, and now his ship was sinking and his men were dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. At approximately 12:15 a.m., just 10 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the list reached critical. The ship rolled further and further to starboard, past 45 degrees. Men still on deck tumbled into the sea. Equipment broke loose and slid across the deck. The ship groaned. The sound of steel tearing, of bulkheads collapsing, of a dying vessel in her final agony. Commander Flynn appeared beside the captain. "Sir, we need to go. Now?" McVeigh nodded. Together with Flynn and a few other officers still on the bridge, he stepped to the side of the tilting deck and slid down into the ocean. The water was warm. This was the tropical Pacific, where the ocean temperature hovers around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Under other circumstances, it might have been pleasant, but men were screaming in the darkness. Oil covered the surface, coating everyone who entered the water in thick black sludge that burned eyes and throat and lungs. The smell was overwhelming, bunker fuel mixed with chemicals and smoke. At 12:18 a.m., the bow of USS Indianapolis dipped beneath the surface. The stern rose higher and higher into the air, the massive propellers still visible in the moonlight, dripping seawater. For a moment, the ship hung there, vertical, like a finger pointing at the sky, a final gesture of defiance before the end. Then, with a sound like thunder, she slipped beneath the waves. The suction was real. Men swimming too close were pulled under, dragged down into the darkness. Some fought free and clawed their way back to the surface. Others were never seen again. From the first torpedo strike to the final plunge, only 12 minutes had passed. The worst naval disaster in United States history had just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the survivors faced their first challenge, finding each other in the darkness. Nearly 900 men had made it off the ship alive. Some estimates put the number as high as 900, others as low as 800. The exact count would never be known because in the chaos and darkness, accurate numbers were impossible. What is certain is that hundreds of men were now scattered across several square miles of ocean, most wearing life jackets, many injured, all covered in thick oil. The life jackets were the kapok, filled vest type, bulky, uncomfortable, and designed to keep an unconscious man's head above water. They worked after a fashion, but they weren't meant for long-term survival. The kapok absorbed water over time, making the jackets heavier and less buoyant, and they did nothing to support the body. Men hung vertically in the water, their legs dangling below them, exposed to anything that might be swimming beneath the surface. In those first hours, survival meant finding others. Men called out in the darkness, swimming toward voices. Small groups began to form, 2 or 3 men clinging together, then 5, then 10. The natural human instinct to seek companionship, to not die alone, drew them together. Dr. Lewis Haynes found himself in the water, surrounded by hundreds of men. As the most senior medical officer present in his group, he immediately began trying to organize them. He called out, identifying himself, telling men to swim toward his voice. Slowly, a group of several hundred sailors coalesced around him, but many were badly injured. Burns were the most common wound, flash burns from the explosions, oil burns from the fires, chemical burns from contact with hot fuel. Men's faces were blistered and peeling. Haynes had no medical supplies, no bandages, no morphine, nothing but seawater to try to help them. All he could do was comfort them and try to keep them alive until rescue came. Because rescue would come, it had to. This was the United States Navy. Ships didn't just disappear. Someone would notice Indianapolis was missing. Search planes would be dispatched. They'd be picked up within hours. A day at most. The men clung to this belief because the alternative was unthinkable. Captain McVeigh found himself in a different group, perhaps a quarter-mile away. He'd managed to grab a life jacket before abandoning ship, and he'd come up near a small cluster of officers and enlisted men. As senior officer present, he began trying to establish order. He called for reports on who was present, who was injured, whether anyone had managed to salvage any supplies. The answer was grim. A few life rafts had made it off the ship, but not many. Most men had only their life jackets. No one had food. No one had fresh water. A few men had managed to grab signal flares, but they were debating whether to use them. Would flares attract rescue, or would they attract the submarine that had sunk them? The submarine, in those first hours that was a constant fear. Was I-58 still out there? Would she surface and machine gun the survivors as some Japanese submarines had been known to do? Every sound, every ripple in the water, sparked panic that the sub was coming back to finish them off. In fact, Commander Hashimoto had already departed. After firing his torpedoes, he dove deep and waited for the expected counterattack from American destroyers. When none came, he cautiously returned to periscope depth and observed the cruiser going down. He noted the time in his log, confirmed the kill, and then departed the area to avoid any rescue vessels that might be responding. He had no way of knowing that no rescue vessels were coming because no distress signal had been sent. I-58 would continue her patrol for another week before returning to Japan, where Hashimoto would report sinking an Indianapolis-class cruiser. It was the last major warship sunk by the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II, a final, bitter victory in a war that was already lost. But the survivors knew none of this. They only knew they were alone in the dark, miles from land, waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. That first night was a kaleidoscope of horror and small mercies. The horror came in many forms. Men died from their injuries, burns so severe that their bodies went into shock, internal injuries from the explosions, broken bones from jumping from the ship. Others simply gave up, removing their life jackets and slipping silently beneath the surface. The psychological shock of watching your ship sink, of being suddenly cast into the ocean, broke some men immediately. The oil was its own torture. It coated everything, skin, hair, face, mouth. Men vomited from swallowing it, which only made things worse because vomiting meant getting more oil in their mouths. It burned eyes until men could barely see. It clogged noses and made breathing difficult. And it marked every survivor with a black coating that would take days to wear off. But there were small mercies too. The water was warm. Cold water kills quickly through hypothermia, but in the tropical Pacific, a man could survive for days before body temperature became critical. The sea was relatively calm, no storm, no high waves to drown the struggling swimmers, and the moon had risen, providing enough light to see nearby companions, to maintain the psychological comfort of not being utterly alone. Men talked to pass the time and keep their spirits up. They shared stories about home, about their families, about what they'd do when they got back to the States. Sailors from the same division stuck together. The bonds formed during months and years of service, holding them together now when it mattered most. Some men prayed. The Lord's Prayer was recited over and over by Catholics and Protestants and men who hadn't set foot in a church since basic training. In extremis, everyone finds faith or at least finds prayer. Others sang. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree was a favorite, a popular wartime tune that reminded them of sweethearts back home. The singing helped keep morale up and helped groups stay together in the darkness. If you could hear the singing, you could swim toward it and not be alone. Dr. Haynes made his way through his group, checking on injured men, offering what comfort he could. He found Captain Edward Park, the ship's executive officer and a close friend. Park had been badly burned. His face and hands were blistered and raw. Haynes stayed with him, talking quietly, trying to keep his friend's mind off the pain. By dawn, Park would be dead. As the night wore on, a new problem emerged: thirst, surrounded by water but unable to drink any of it. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without fresh water, less in tropical heat where sweating and exertion accelerate dehydration. Already men's mouths were dry, lips were beginning to crack. The oil coating their throats made it worse. A few men, desperate, drank seawater. Those who'd been in the Navy for a while tried to stop them. Everyone knew you don't drink seawater. The salt content is too high, forcing your kidneys to use more water to process it than you gain by drinking it. Drinking seawater accelerates dehydration and eventually causes hallucinations and madness. But tell that to a man dying of thirst and see if logic prevails. Around 3:00 a.m., someone shouted that they could see lights. A ship everyone strained to see. There on the horizon, lights, rescue, they'd been found. Men shouted and waved. Some of the groups with flares debated firing them. But as they watched, the lights moved parallel to their position, not toward them. And then they disappeared over the horizon. It might have been a ship. More likely, it was a hallucination, a trick of the moon on the waves. Or perhaps it was a real ship, miles away, whose lookouts never saw the tiny black specks of human heads in the vast ocean. Hope, briefly kindled, died again. Captain McVeigh, floating with his group, began to calculate in his mind. Indianapolis had been due to arrive in late on July 31st, tomorrow afternoon. When she didn't arrive on schedule, someone would notice. Questions would be asked. A search would be initiated. So they needed to survive perhaps 24 hours, maybe 36 at the outside. They could do that. The men were strong. They had life jackets. The weather was calm. They could hold on for a day. What McVeigh didn't know, what none of them knew, was that when Indianapolis failed to arrive at late on schedule, no one would notice at all. Dawn came slowly to the Philippine Sea. The first light was a pale gray on the eastern horizon, gradually brightening to pink and then gold as the sun hauled itself above the ocean's rim. For the survivors of Indianapolis, that sunrise revealed the full scope of their situation for the first time. They were scattered across an area of approximately 12 square miles. The groups ranged in size from individual swimmers to clusters of several hundred men. The largest group, led by Dr. Haynes, numbered somewhere around 400 men. Captain McVeigh's group had perhaps 50. Dozens of smaller groups dotted the ocean, 10 men here, 20 there, some clinging to life rafts, most just treading water in their life jackets. The life rafts were a precious commodity. Indianapolis had carried dozens of them, but only a handful had made it off the ship. They were small, designed to hold maybe 10 or 12 men, and they contained minimal survival supplies. Some had a small amount of fresh water in sealed tins. A few had emergency rations, fishing line, and flares. But distributed among hundreds of survivors, these supplies were barely a drop in the ocean. The rafts themselves became sources of conflict. 12 men could sit in a raft, but 50 men would cling to its sides, trying to get their upper bodies out of the water, trying to rest. The men in the raft had to constantly push others away to keep from being swamped. Arguments broke out. Fists flew. Men who had been shipmates for months turned on each other over the chance to rest for a few minutes out of the water. As the sun rose higher, the temperature began to climb. The warm water that had been a mercy during the night now became a curse. Under the tropical sun, with no shade, no protection, the men began to burn. Faces turned red, then began to blister. Lips cracked and bled. The oil coating on their skin made it worse, causing chemical burns on top of sunburn. And the thirst intensified. By mid-morning on the first full day, every man was desperately thirsty. Throats were raw. Mouths were dry as cotton. The men in the groups that had rafts with water rations faced an agonizing decision: distribute what little they had now, or save it for later when things might be worse. Dr. Haynes, in command of the largest group, made the call to ration strictly. A tiny sip for the most severe cases only. Everyone else would have to wait. It was a decision that saved lives and also earned him the hatred of men mad with thirst. More men drank seawater on that first day. Despite warnings, despite threats, despite the pleading of their companions, they ducked their heads under and drank deep of the salt ocean. Within hours, the effects became apparent. They became agitated, restless. Their eyes took on a glassy, unfocused look. They began to talk nonsense. The hallucinations had begun. Some men saw islands on the horizon and insisted they could swim to them. Their friends tried to hold them back, but several broke free and struck out swimming, convinced that palm trees and fresh water were just a few hundred yards away. They were never seen again. Whether they drowned from exhaustion or from something else that pulled them under, no one knew. Others hallucinated that Indianapolis was still afloat, just below the surface. They dove down, trying to reach the ship, trying to get to the fresh water they knew was stored below decks. Some of these men didn't come back up. The worst hallucinations involved the ship's store and the soda fountain, that uniquely American luxury that big Navy ships carried. Men swore they could see it right there, just a few feet down, Coca-Cola. Ice cream, fresh water from the fountain. They dove for it and drowned reaching for mirages. And then, on that first morning, someone saw the fin. The first fin appeared around mid-morning on that first full day. A triangular shape cutting through the water, maybe 50 yards from one of the groups. At first, the men weren't sure what they were seeing. A dolphin, maybe, but dolphins didn't circle like that. Dolphins didn't move with that particular kind of purposeful menace. Then someone saw the distinctive white-tipped fins and the awful truth became clear. Oceanic whitetip sharks, Carcharhinus longimanus*, one of the most aggressive shark species in the world, and the dominant predator in the deep, open ocean of the Pacific. These weren't the great white sharks of Hollywood nightmares. Oceanic whitetips are smaller, typically 8 to 10 feet long. But what they lack in size, they make up for in aggression and numbers. They're scavengers and opportunists, known to investigate anything in the water. Jacques Cousteau would later call them the most dangerous of all sharks, and they were gathering. The blood in the water had called them first. Hundreds of injured men, bleeding from burns and wounds, had been floating in the same area for over 12 hours. The scent had drifted on the currents, reaching sharks miles away. Then came the vibrations, the thrashing and movement of hundreds of men treading water, kicking, struggling, to a shark's lateral line, the sensory organ that detects movement in water. It must have sounded like a dinner bell. One fin became two became 5. By early afternoon on that first day, the men could see dozens of sharks circling their groups. Ensign Harlan Twibble, floating with one of the smaller groups, watched the sharks circle closer. At first they just looked at us, he later recalled. They'd come in close, maybe 10 or 15 feet, and they'd swim around us. You could see their dead eyes watching, then they'd swim away. It was like they were sizing us up, deciding what we were. The sharks were doing exactly that. Oceanic whitetips are cautious hunters. They investigate potential prey carefully before attacking, but they're also persistent. Once they identify something as food, they don't leave. The first attack came in the early afternoon. A sailor had separated from his group, swimming toward a hallucinated island or just drifting away in exhausted delirium. He was alone, 50 yards from the nearest group, when a shark came up from below. The men watching saw the water erupt, a thrashing, churning chaos of white foam and dark shapes. The sailor screamed, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Then he vanished beneath the surface. A moment later, a cloud of blood spread across the water. The ocean went silent. Every man who had witnessed the attack stopped moving, stopped breathing, frozen in terror. Then the screaming began again, somewhere else. Another attack, and another. The sharks had decided the men in the water were prey. What happened over the next 3 days defies easy description. It was a sustained nightmare. Hundreds of men floating helpless in the ocean while sharks methodically hunted them. The attacks followed a pattern that the survivors came to recognize with horrible familiarity. The sharks preferred isolated victims, men who had drifted away from groups, who were unconscious or dead, who were too weak to fight back. They would circle first, coming closer with each pass, then strike from below with stunning speed. A man would be floating one moment, and the next he would be yanked underwater with shocking violence. Sometimes he'd resurface, screaming, blood pouring from massive wounds. Sometimes he wouldn't resurface at all. The ocean would simply swallow him, leaving only a spreading red stain. The survivors learned quickly. Stay in groups, keep moving, make noise. Sharks seemed less likely to attack large clusters of men who were actively kicking and splashing. So the groups contracted, men pressing close together despite the discomfort, safety in numbers being the only safety they had. Dr. Haynes organized his group of 400 men into a defensive formation. He had them form a circle, facing outward, kicking constantly to create turbulence in the water. The wounded and unconscious were kept in the center, supported by others. It was exhausting, kicking for hours on end, treading water, maintaining the formation. But it seemed to help, but the men died anyway. Some died from their injuries, succumbing to burns or internal wounds sustained in the sinking. These deaths were almost merciful. A man would close his eyes, his head would slip beneath his life jacket, and he'd be gone. His companions would try to revive him, but without medical supplies, without even fresh water, there was little they could do. The bodies presented a terrible dilemma. The dead men's life jackets could save the living. Several men had lost their jackets or were wearing damaged ones, but to strip a body meant acknowledging your shipmate was truly gone. It meant violating the corpse of a friend. They did it anyway because the alternative was death, but the bodies themselves attracted sharks. The men learned to push corpses away quickly, to let them drift off and draw the sharks with them. It was a horrible calculus, using their dead friends as bait to save themselves. But in extremis, morality becomes flexible. Giles McCoy, the young Marine, found himself in a group of about 30 men clinging to 2 small rafts. They'd lashed the rafts together for stability and took turns sitting in them to rest. On the first full day, a shark attacked a sailor who'd been floating near the rafts. It came out of nowhere. McCoy later testified. 1 second he was there, the next he was screaming, and the water was red. We pulled him onto the raft, but his leg was... McCoy had paused, unable to continue for a moment. His leg was gone from the knee down. We tried to stop the bleeding, but we had nothing. No bandages, no tourniquets. He bled out in about 20 minutes. They kept his body on the raft for several hours, unable to bring themselves to commit him to the sea. But as the sun set and the sharks circled closer, they finally slipped him over the side. Within seconds, the sharks were on the corpse, tearing it apart in a frenzy of violence that sent the survivors paddling desperately away. Not all the deaths came from sharks. Some came from men who had lost their minds. The combination of dehydration, sun exposure, exhaustion, and terror broke men psychologically. Those who'd drunk seawater deteriorated fastest, but even those who'd resisted the temptation began to hallucinate by the second day. Some men became convinced the Japanese were in the water with them, trying to stab them. They fought invisible enemies, thrashing and screaming, exhausting themselves until they drowned or their hearts gave out. Others became paranoid, certain that their companions were trying to kill them, trying to steal their life jackets. Fights broke out. Men who'd been friends for years tried to drown each other over imagined slights. The most disturbing hallucinations involved the ship. Men became absolutely convinced that Indianapolis was right there, just below the surface, intact and safe. They could see it, they insisted. The captain was calling for them to come below for ice cream and fresh water. All they had to do was swim down and they'd be saved. No amount of reasoning could convince them otherwise. They'd remove their life jackets, can't swim down with a life jacket on, and dive beneath the surface. Their companions would wait for them to resurface to come to their senses. Most never came back up. Dr. Haynes watched helplessly as men in his group succumbed one by one. He tried to identify those starting to hallucinate and have others watch them constantly. But with 400 men and no clear chain of command, it was impossible to prevent every tragedy. He found himself making medical triage decisions without any medical tools. Who got the tiny rations of water? Who got to rest in the few available rafts? Who was too far gone to save? These were decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in the moment, they had to be made. Captain Park died on the second day. Haynes had stayed with him as much as possible, but the burns were too severe. Infection had set in. In the warm ocean water, bacteria multiplied rapidly in open wounds. Park developed a fever, became delirious, and finally slipped away. Haynes said a prayer, removed Park's life jacket, and let his friend's body drift away. Within an hour, the sharks had found it. While nearly 900 men died slowly in the Philippine Sea, the United States Navy, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, had no idea anything was wrong. This failure of communication would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire disaster. Indianapolis had been scheduled to arrive at Lake Gulf on July 31st at 11:00 a.m. When she didn't appear, no one noticed. The routing officer at Lake assumed she'd been delayed or diverted. Ships changed schedules all the time in wartime. It wasn't unusual and didn't warrant investigation. The harbor master at Guam, where Indianapolis had departed, assumed she'd reached Lake safely. He'd received no distress call, so obviously everything was fine. The command structure that should have been tracking her location had failed at every level. There was confusion about who was responsible for monitoring her transit. The orders placing her under the command of Vice Admiral Oldendorf's task force hadn't been properly communicated. Oldendorf's staff didn't know they were supposed to be expecting her. The standing orders regarding overdue ships were vague. Some commands had policies requiring investigation if a ship was overdue. Others didn't. At Lake, no such policy existed. So Indianapolis simply disappeared from the Navy's awareness. Nearly 200 men, a heavy cruiser worth millions of dollars, just gone, and no one noticed. Meanwhile, Navy ships and aircraft crisscrossed the Philippine Sea daily, destroyers on patrol, Pibuay Catalina flying boats on antis, submarine sweeps, transport ships moving supplies, all of them passing within miles, sometimes within visual range, of the survivors. But spotting men in the water is nearly impossible from any distance. The ocean is vast and human heads are tiny. The oil-covered survivors were dark against dark water. Unless you were looking specifically for them, unless you knew exactly where to look, you could sail right past and never see them. And no one was looking. On the second day, a Navy bomber flew directly overhead. The men went crazy, screaming and waving, splashing to attract attention. Those with signal mirrors, a few had been salvaged from the rafts, flashed them desperately at the plane. The plane flew on without changing course. Whether the crew saw them and didn't recognize them as survivors, or simply didn't see them at all, would never be known. But the hope that had surged through the survivors when they saw the aircraft turned to crushing despair as it disappeared over the horizon. They'd been so certain that rescue was imminent, that someone, somewhere, knew they were missing and was searching for them. The indifferent passage of that aircraft suggested otherwise. Captain McVeigh, floating with his small group, began to realize the horrible truth. No one was coming. No one knew they were here. He'd commanded ships for years. He understood Navy procedures. He knew that Indianapolis should have been reported overdue by now. The fact that no search planes were overhead, no ships were investigating, meant that somehow the system had failed. They'd fallen through the cracks. He didn't share this realization with the men around him. Morale was already fragile, but he began to prepare himself psychologically for the possibility that they might be in the water for days, not hours. He had no idea it would be even worse than he feared. By the morning of August 1st, the third day, the survivors were in desperate condition. Dehydration was critical. Men's tongues had swollen in their mouths. Lips were cracked and bleeding. Skin was peeling from severe sunburn. Eyes were swollen nearly shut from salt water and sun exposure. Many men were delirious, barely conscious. The shark attacks continued relentlessly. If anything, they'd intensified. The sharks had lost their caution, becoming bolder. They'd learned that the men in the water couldn't really fight back, couldn't hurt them. Attacks came during daylight now, not just at night. The worst attacks were the ones everyone witnessed. A shark would strike a man in the middle of a group. The victim would scream and thrash, blood spreading in the water. His companions would try to pull him to safety, fighting the shark, kicking at the massive body. Sometimes they succeeded in driving the shark off. More often, they watched helplessly as their friend was pulled under. Yeoman Victor Buck, it was in Dr. Haynes's group when he witnessed one of the most horrific attacks. A young sailor, Bucket thought he was maybe 19 years old, was floating near him when a shark struck from below. The impact lifted the sailor partially out of the water. His scream was cut short as he was dragged under. We could see it happening below the surface, Bucket later said. The water was clear enough that we could see the shark shaking him like a dog shaking a rag, the blood. There was so much blood. The sailor's body surfaced briefly, then was pulled down again. The shark wasn't alone anymore. Other sharks had been attracted by the blood and were joining the attack. Within a minute, there was nothing left but shredded life jacket fabric floating on the surface. The psychological impact of witnessing these attacks was devastating. Men who'd held on for 2 days, who'd fought thirst and exhaustion and pain, simply gave up after watching a shipmate torn apart. They'd remove their life jackets and let themselves slip under, choosing a quick death by drowning over waiting for the sharks. Dr. Haynes tried to keep morale up, but he was exhausted himself. He'd been awake for 3 days straight, supporting wounded men, organizing the group, administering the tiny water rations they had left. He was sunburned, dehydrated, and running on pure willpower. His group had shrunk noticeably. Of the roughly 400 men who'd formed the original group, perhaps 300 remained. The others had died, from injuries, dehydration, shark attacks, or simply giving up. Bodies drifted away constantly, marked by the sharks that followed to claim them. The smaller groups were suffering even worse. Some had been entirely eliminated, whether from sharks, exhaustion, or men simply drifting apart until they were alone and vulnerable, no one knew. When rescue finally came, they would find lone survivors who were the last remnants of groups that had numbered dozens. Captain McVeigh's group was more fortunate than most. They'd managed to salvage 2 decent rafts and had enough life jackets for everyone. McVeigh maintained strict discipline, rationing water, rotating men through the rafts, keeping watches. His command presence kept the group cohesive when others were falling apart. But even McVeigh's group had losses. Men died from their injuries. One sailor, badly burned, developed what was obviously a severe infection. His wounds had gone septic in the warm water. He developed a raging fever and became delirious. Despite efforts to cool him with seawater and keep him comfortable, he died on the 3rd morning. They slipped him over the side with a brief prayer. The sharks took him within minutes. Giles McCoy, the young Marine, was reaching his breaking point. He'd watched men die for 3 days. He was severely sunburned, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and his throat was so dry he could barely speak. The hallucinations were starting. He kept seeing islands on the horizon, kept thinking he could hear ships' engines. He wasn't alone. By the 3rd day, the majority of survivors were hallucinating to some degree. The line between reality and delusion was blurring. Men had conversations with people who weren't there. They saw rescue ships that didn't exist. They smelled food cooking and heard music playing. The human mind, pushed past its limits by dehydration, exhaustion, and trauma, was breaking down, and still the sharks circled. What the survivors didn't know, couldn't know, was that their absence had still not been reported. On the morning of August 1st, 3 full days after the sinking, USS Indianapolis remained officially in transit, according to Navy records. No one at Leyte had filed a report that she was overdue. No one at Guam had followed up to confirm her arrival. The intermediate commands that should have been tracking her movement had simply assumed someone else was handling it. In the vast bureaucracy of the Pacific Fleet, with hundreds of ships moving between dozens of ports, Indianapolis had simply fallen through the cracks. But there was more to it than simple administrative oversight. The cargo Indianapolis had delivered to Tinian was so secret that even her movement orders had been compartmentalized. Few people knew where she'd been or where she was going. The secrecy that had protected the atomic bomb project now worked against the survivors, because no one wanted to admit they didn't know where a ship carrying atomic secrets had gone. At various levels of command, officers were making assumptions rather than asking questions that might reveal their ignorance of classified operations. It was easier to assume Indianapolis had been diverted on another secret mission than to file a report that might expose the fact that you'd lost track of a ship involved in the Manhattan Project? The culture of secrecy, combined with bureaucratic confusion and the general chaos of managing a massive military operation across half the globe, created a perfect storm of negligence, and 900 men were dying because of it. On Tinian Island, Major Furman and Captain Nolan, the officers who'd accompanied the atomic cargo, knew Indianapolis had departed for late, but they assumed she'd arrived safely. Their mission was complete. What happened to the ship afterward wasn't their concern. The crews assembling the atomic bombs worked around the clock, preparing Little Boy for its appointment with Hiroshima. The uranium Indianapolis had delivered was being carefully machined and fitted into the bomb's core. In less than a week, it would be loaded aboard Enola Gay for the flight that would change history. The irony was lost on everyone at the time. The ship that had delivered the war-ending weapon was dying, and the same secrecy that protected that weapon was preventing anyone from noticing. The question that would be asked later, during the investigations, the court-martial, the congressional inquiries, was why the death toll was so high. Of the approximately 196 men aboard Indianapolis, only 316 would be rescued alive. That meant 880 men died, a mortality rate of over 73%. It was the worst loss of life from a single ship sinking in U.S. Navy history. Some died in the initial torpedo attack and sinking. Perhaps 300 men killed instantly in the explosions or trapped below decks as the ship went down. But that meant roughly 900 men made it into the water alive. Of those 900, only 316 survived. Nearly 600 men died over the course of 4 days, floating in relatively warm water, waiting for rescue. The sharks were part of it. Estimates of men killed by sharks range from 150 to as many as 600, depending on the source. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Many deaths attributed to sharks were likely men who drowned first and were then scavenged by sharks. But many, too many, were alive when the sharks took them. Dehydration killed many more. The human body loses water constantly through perspiration, respiration, and urination. In tropical heat, floating in salt water, surrounded by sun-reflecting ocean, the water loss is accelerated. Men who drank no fresh water at all could survive perhaps 3 to 5 days before dying of dehydration. But the supplies salvaged from the ship were minimal. A few rafts had small amounts of canned water, perhaps enough for a few dozen men. Distributed among 900, it was a drop in the ocean. Most men had no fresh water at all after the first day. Sun exposure and hypothermia, even in warm water, the body slowly loses heat contributed. Men developed severe sunburn that turned into sun poisoning. Infections set in from wounds exposed to bacteria-laden seawater. Exhaustion, treading water for days, caused heart attacks and simple physical collapse, and psychological breakdown claimed many. The human mind isn't designed to handle this level of sustained trauma. Men went insane, fought each other, committed suicide, or simply gave up and let themselves drown. But underlying all of it was the simple fact that rescue took too long. If search planes had been dispatched on July 31st, when Indianapolis didn't arrive at late as scheduled, hundreds of lives would have been saved. If proper communication protocols had been followed, if anyone, in the chain of command had noticed a heavy cruiser was missing, the survivors could have been rescued within 24 hours. Instead, they floated for 4 days while the Navy remained oblivious to their plight. The failure would eventually lead to changes in Navy procedures, but for the men dying in the Philippine Sea, those changes would come too late. August 2nd dawned with hazy skies and a building swell. The weather was beginning to deteriorate, not a storm, but the sea was rougher than it had been. Waves of 3 or 4 feet made it harder to stay together, harder to support wounded men, harder to survive. By now, the survivors were in extremis. 4 days without meaningful food or water, 4 days of sun exposure, 4 days of constant fear and exhaustion. They were beyond suffering into a kind of numb endurance, bodies running on reserves that were nearly depleted. Dr. Haynes's group had shrunk to perhaps 200 men, Half of those were barely conscious. Haynes himself was hallucinating, seeing rescue ships that weren't there, hearing voices calling him. But he maintained enough presence of mind to keep functioning, to keep giving orders, to keep the group together. Captain McVeigh's group was in better shape, thanks to the rafts and McVeigh's strict discipline. But even they were failing. Men were too weak to kick anymore. The watchers were falling asleep. McVeigh himself was severely sunburned and dehydrated, but he refused to show weakness. As commander, he had to keep it together. The sharks were still there, always there. The attacks had become almost routine, background horror to the general suffering. Men barely reacted anymore when someone screamed. They'd become numb to it. Around mid-morning, something changed. Several men reported hearing an aircraft engine. Most dismissed it. They'd heard phantom engines for 3 days. But the sound grew louder. More men heard it. Then someone spotted it. A PV-1 Ventura bomber, flying low over the water. The survivors erupted in desperate action. Men waved frantically. Those with mirrors flashed them. The groups tried to cluster together to make a larger target. Some men, in a final desperate gamble, fired their last flares. The plane flew on without changing course. Hope died. Men sobbed openly. Some simply stopped moving, ready to give up entirely. But what they didn't know was that aboard that Ventura bomber, something remarkable had just happened. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwinn, the pilot, had spotted something in the water. After 4 days of dying, rescue was finally at hand. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwinn wasn't looking for survivors. He was looking for Japanese submarines. The 25-year-old Navy pilot was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol out of Tinian Island, droning over the Philippine Sea at 3.0 feet in his twin-engine PV-1 Ventura bomber. It was tedious work, hours of staring at empty ocean, watching for periscope wakes or the telltale oil slick of a submarine running submerged. Around 11:00 a.m. on August 2nd, Gwinn noticed his antenna wire trailing from the aircraft was broken. It was a minor malfunction, but it would prevent him from transmitting messages clearly. He dropped to a lower altitude, about 900 feet, to get a better look at the damage and see if he could assess whether it needed immediate attention. That decision to drop altitude saved hundreds of lives. At the lower altitude, Gwynn's bombardier, Joseph Johnson, spotted something odd in the water, an oil slick, a long dark streak on the surface of the ocean. It looked like it might be from a submarine. Gwinn altered course to investigate, following the slick. Standard procedure: track it, see if a periscope appears, call in the location for other ships to investigate. But as they flew along the oil trail, Johnson saw something that didn't make sense. There were objects in the water, small dark shapes scattered across the surface. At first, they looked like floating debris. But as Gwinn dropped even lower, down to 300 feet, the horrifying truth became apparent. They were men, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "Chuck, those are people down there," Johnson said over the intercom, his voice shocked. Gwinn pulled the Ventura into a tight circle, coming around for another pass. Through binoculars, they could see men waving frantically, tiny arms raised toward the sky in desperate supplication. Some were in rafts. Most were just floating in life jackets. Gwinn had no idea what ship they were from or how long they'd been in the water, but he knew they needed help immediately. He grabbed his radio and broadcast on the emergency frequency. Spotted life rafts and survivors in water. Position 11 degrees 50 north, 133 degrees 47 east. Need all available rescue craft immediately. Then he dropped even lower and began circling to mark the position, to let the survivors know they'd been seen, that help was coming. Below in